Thank you for the lovely introduction, Jim. That was really very nice. Okay, well, I see a lot of friends in the audience tonight, and I want to thank all of you for coming out to hear me talk about my new book, Getting Screwed: Sex Workers and the Law. I was going to dress like Julia Roberts at the beginning of Pretty Women, but then I thought, no, why perpetuate the stereotypes about how sex workers dress? Besides, I'm afraid I don't have Julia Roberts' figure. Okay. In a more serious vein, I'd like to tell you a few stories about the women and men I've met in the course of researching this book, to give you a sense of how their lives are really quite different from the stereotypes that many people have about prostitutes. I'm also going to talk about how the laws that criminalize prostitution make these sex workers' lives so difficult and jeopardize everyone's public health and safety. And then I'll read a short excerpt from my book and open the floor up to your questions. But I also want to remind you that we're going to be having some tasty food here afterwards, and I'll be signing books as well. So I hope you can stick around for a little fun. Okay, I'd like to start by telling you about the first time I had sex with, oh my God, what a Freudian slip! I've never had, a disclaimer, I've never had sex with a prostitute. Anyway, I'd like to tell you about the first time I had coffee with a prostitute. Thank you very much. I'm not too nervous. I had agreed to meet her at one of those hip cafes in Northampton, which is a gentrified college town in western Massachusetts. Her professional name was Jillian, and I already knew that she came from a middle-class Orthodox Jewish background and that she spent much of her time doing volunteer work on behalf of disenfranchised people, including people with mental illness, prisoners, and the homeless. So when I was already at the cafe, and she arrived a few minutes later, dressed entirely in black, a low-cut black top, a long black skirt, and a black leather jacket adorned with a button that read activist. Her long hair was jet black, and she had a full figure, a pale face, and freckles across her nose. I was immediately struck by how articulate and well-educated Jillian was. Although she had dropped out of college, she was widely read and had informed opinions about capitalism, the psychiatric establishment, the socio-political structure of the United States, you name it. During our chat, the topic of how she, who was then 27, earned a living came up. I enjoy being a middle-class escort, she said, as if what she did was just another ordinary job. I provide a girlfriend experience for an hour. It's fun. Jillian told me that she did sex work so she would have time for her true passion, volunteering to help others less fortunate than herself and changing society. She styled herself as a latter-day Emma Goldman. She wanted to change the way we do business in this country. She said the first time she turned a trick, it felt like magic. She was wearing what she calls insta-ho clothing, a tight skirt and a frilly blouse with long black boots. And here's how she described the encounter. It was an older man who wanted a 10-minute hand job, and I came out with $150. Patti Smith's song, Free Money, was blaring in my brain as I galloped back to the car. Now, I met with Jillian several times over the next year or two, and she opened up a fascinating window onto the reality of being a sex worker in the 21st century. When I expressed an interest in writing about prostitution, she put me in touch with other sex workers around the country. The stories that Jillian and her compatriots told me clashed with the popular narrative, as Jim talked about, of all prostitutes being drug-addicted, victimized women who are forced into the trade by abusive pimps and traffickers. Research by respected scholars also contradicted this narrative and pointed to a very different story, that laws criminalizing prostitution are not only largely ineffective in curbing the sex trade, but are creating an atmosphere that encourages the exploitation of sex workers and violence against all women. A growing body of research shows that anti-prostitution laws not only make it more difficult for sex workers to protect themselves, only make it more difficult for sex workers to protect themselves from physical harm and from sexually transmitted diseases such as HIV. I also learned that despite the moralistic tone the media takes whenever a well-known politician gets caught with a sex worker, the demand for commercial sex continues to grow and flourish under new guises, blurring the lines between what is legal and what is not. For example, I don't know how many of you know this, but escort services, strip clubs, private lap dance parties, and pornography are all legal, and they constitute a multi-billion-dollar industry. Indeed, the sex industry here has largely converged with other mainstream service industries. In my book, I write about how this is happening in Nevada, the only state in the nation that currently has legal brothels in some of its rural counties. Even so, the individuals who work in this increasingly mainstreamed industry remain marginalized by social stigma and are often exploited. As freelance contractors rather than employees, even the women who work in legal brothels have very few rights to protect themselves from labor abuses. The situation for women and men who work in the illegal sector is far worse. While anti-prostitution laws have done little to stem the thriving industry in commercial sex, they exact a high price on public health and safety. Many sex workers fear getting arrested if they report violent clients or exploitative pimps. Hence, the criminalization of prostitution allows killers and others to prey on women with impunity. Predators target prostitutes precisely because they are less likely to go to the police, and non-prostitutes are victimized as well when killers go unchecked. In Getting Screwed, I tell the heartbreaking story of Carmen Rudy, a street worker and single mother in Massachusetts, who disappeared one night while she was on the stroll on Worcester's main drag. I also tell the stories of higher-end sex workers like Julie Moya, a madame in Manhattan, and Joy Love, a beautiful escort from Providence, both of whom were arrested and accused of crimes they didn't commit. Julie Moya's story, as you'll see from reading the book, is one of resilience, of triumph over tragedy. Julie ran away from an unhappy home life when she was 14 and ended up strip dancing at a club in Cincinnati owned by Larry Flynt, who, as many of you know, went on to publish Hustler magazine. In time, Julie, whose blonde hair, full figure, and sparkling green eyes made her seem older than she was, gravitated to sex work because she liked the attention and money it brought her way. But because she knew about girls being mistreated at a brothel across the border, Julie soon found herself in the crosshairs of some pimps, and her life was threatened. In the nick of time, the FBI whisked her into a witness protection program, and you can read about what happened in the book. I'm going to actually read an excerpt about her so you know she survived the witness protection program. Then there is Joy Love. That's her work name, of course. The escort I met in Providence, Rhode Island. Did you know that until 2009, Rhode Island was the only other state in the nation besides Nevada in which some form of prostitution was legal? For 30 years, it was not illegal to provide paid sex as long as it was indoors. Outdoors sex work remained illegal. And that was because of a loophole in the law. It's a long story, which I tell in the book. So Providence became known as a hub for spas and brothels up and down the East Coast. What I find most interesting about this episode is that incidents of rape and sexually transmitted diseases went down in Rhode Island during this period. This decriminalized atmosphere is why Joy, who grew up in California and moved to Virginia with her husband and kids, came to Providence in the first place. I met her for the first time in that glitzy Providence Place mall, which is a stone's throw from Brown University. She was impeccably dressed in a caramel knit sweater and tight white jeans that showed off her willowy figure. I was struck by how elegant Joy was and how articulate. She had a mane of long, curly black hair, big brown eyes, and ebony skin. Like Jillian and Julie, Joy defies the conventional stereotypes many people have about sex workers. She actually spent many years in the white-collar world as an IT specialist and accountant for Virginia State and other universities. She worked for Mark Warner's first gubernatorial campaign and was invited to his inaugural ball. But her youngest daughter had a rare skin condition, and the medical bills for her care were mounting. So in 2006, Joy, who by then was divorced, decided to leave her 9-to-5 job to go into sex work. As I describe in the book, she had previously done short stints at 2 of the legal brothels in Nevada, and so she knew what she was getting into. After moving to Providence, Joy, in very short order, built up an impressive list of highbrow clients, including judges and lawyers, military personnel, businessmen, and Brown University professors. And then Rhode Island's state legislatures pulled the rug out from under her by basically closing the loophole that made indoor sex work permissible. One of those legislators, by the way, was a regular client of Joy's. And when she asked him about it, he said, "Oh, that's just politics. It has nothing to do with us." She thought that was rather hypocritical. That's what she told me. The second time Joy and I met was at her outwardly nondescript home in a residential area of North Providence. She showed me her, quote, classroom, a small room that had a kid's writing desk where students can get spanked by teacher. She also showed me the, quote, medical exam room with a metal examining table and an anatomically correct body chart on the wall. As Joy told me, "I do a lot of role playing. It's not about the sex," she said. "It's about fulfilling someone's fantasy." A few months after my tour, Joy and her boyfriend were watching TV in her living room with 2 other friends when Providence police raided the house, guns drawn, and arrested everyone. Now, not all sex workers are unlucky enough to have run-ins with the law. Take Maddie, for instance, a 26-year-old blonde-haired beauty who, as she describes it, comes from a, quote, Southern Mayflower country club family, unquote. Maddie's client list in Washington, D.C. includes corporate executives and top-ranking government officials. According to Maddie, going to an escort is so prevalent among the upper echelons of our government that if law enforcement really started prosecuting clients, the federal government might collapse. Indeed, Maddie jokes, quote, "My client list alone would be enough to put the country on hold for a few days." Anyway, Maddie is acutely aware that she is at little risk of being arrested since D.C. police and police in many other cities tend to target streetwalkers and sex workers at the lower end of the scale. Even so, she believes passionately that sex work should be decriminalized so that the most vulnerable and marginalized women who ply the trade can better protect themselves from violent predators as well as from the risk of sexually transmitted diseases. Maddie makes the argument, which is backed up by research from other countries, that just as with legalizing marijuana, many of the problems associated with prostitution would diminish once it is decriminalized and regulated to some extent. And that is the argument I make in my book. Now, with your permission, I would really like to read a short excerpt from it. This excerpt, just to give you a little background, is in the chapter I devote to exposing the hype behind the grossly inflated statistics and stories that get spread around trafficking. Okay. The zeal to curb trafficking, even when it isn't happening, may also have been the motivation behind the joint FBI New York Police Department raid that led to Julie Moya's arrest in 2005. As Julie recalls, that frigid January day began like any other workday for her. The temperature outside was in the single digits, and her Honduran maid, Denora, brought her breakfast in bed, bustling in with a cup of Julie's favorite Hawaiian Kona coffee and a bowl of hot cream of rice cereal arranged on a tray. As Julie sipped her coffee and contemplated the day ahead, she thought about how much she had to be thankful for. She owned her 4-bedroom house in Freeport, Long Island, overlooking the canal. From her living room window, she could almost see the marina where her 32-foot family cruiser was docked. Zulu and Natalie, her 2 African gray parrots, jabbered away down the hall, and Pamela, her brightly plumed cockatoo, cooed softly in her cage nearby. Julie Moya had worked hard for all of this, and at 46 she was still working more than 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. It wasn't easy running a top-of-the-line escort business, which she liked to describe as, quote, the nicest, friendliest brothel in New York City, unquote. Her day often started at 11 a.m. when the phones began ringing at the office downtown, men booking lunch appointments with one or another of the girls. While Lucas, her trusted office manager, answered the phones and made appointments, Julie was always on call if a problem arose, one of the girls calling in sick at the last minute or a client insisting on a woman who wasn't available that day and refusing to take no for an answer. Julie herself was usually on site by 4 or 5 p.m. as the evening rush started, and she often found herself settling squabbles among the women. A new girl might try the dirty hustle when a customer came in and was introduced around, running up to him and kissing him or bending down to show him her cleavage, and that would set off the other girls. Julie's day would continue until well past 1 a.m., when the last clients left and all the girls would troop over to the office on 46th Street to get paid, order in Chinese food, and share war stories over laughter and occasional tears. While Julie was starting to think about retiring and turning things over to Lucas and her son, Jerry, she knew retirement was still a few years off. She had a taste for expensive cars, and her hobby, rescuing abandoned or neglected pets and getting them the care they needed until they could be resettled into loving homes, didn't come cheap. In addition, Julie was sending money to her now-grown daughter, who had been born with a birth defect and remained in fragile health. Julie's mother and daughter lived together in Cincinnati, in the same house that Julie had run away from at the age of 14. When she could, she also helped out her older son, Tommy, who lived in Cincinnati with his son and 4 children. With all these expenses, Julie knew she hadn't saved nearly as much as she needed to retire. Not yet, anyway. But she had time. This was the year of the rooster, according to the Chinese zodiac. Her year, Julie thought, as she set aside the tray and swung out of bed. 2 hours later, showered and dressed, Julie and her son climbed into her black Cadillac, I'm mispronouncing it, Cadillac Escalade. Before they headed into Manhattan, they had to drop off Earl Grey at the vet. The old tomcat had feline AIDS. And good thing I write for a living and don't talk for a living. Had feline AIDS and needed surgery, and they also needed to run a few other errands. So it wasn't until around 3 p.m. that they drove into Midtown and picked up Julie's longtime assistant, Patrina, at one of the 49th Street brothels. Patrina was a hard-working single mother from Guyana, whom Julie was training to help out in the office. She had worked as a maid in Julie's brothels for years, and even though customers occasionally asked for her, she had fine features and a curvaceous figure herself. She always said no. They parked in their usual spot at the 51st Street garage and started walking down the street to Julie's favorite Thai restaurant for a late lunch. But at the last moment, she felt a craving for shrimp mofongo, so they turned around and walked up 9th Avenue to El San Juan, a Puerto Rican eatery. Only later would Julie realize how serendipitous her change of heart had been. The police, she later discovered, had been waiting for her at the Thai restaurant, and they would have arrested her right then and there. When her shrimp mofongo came, Julie ate quickly, anxious to check in and see how things were going at work. But when she called the office on her cell phone, there was no answer. She looked at her watch. Lucas should have picked up. "That's weird," she said. Julie hadn't installed a landline at the 49th Street apartments for security reasons. She didn't want police tapping the phones. Instead, she punched in the number for Beverly, who lived at the 46th Street brothel and looked after the location, but there was no answer there either. Julie's heart began racing. This was beyond strange. Beverly was almost always around in the afternoon. She tried the 46th Street number again. No answer. Finally, she called home, waiting for Denora to pick up. But the phone kept ringing and ringing. Julie threw some cash on the table and pulled on her parka. "Let's see what's going on," she said, and hurried out of the restaurant, Petrina right behind her. Jerry had left the restaurant before she started calling. He said he was going to buy a CD and would meet them at the office. They turned down 49th Street, and the Mexican guy who owned Spoiled Brats, a tiny shop that sold stuffed animals, poked his head out the door and said casually, "There's a party going on up the street. You might want to go back." Julie could see dozens of men clustered outside the entrance to the two buildings where her apartments were. "If we turn around now, they'll notice," Petrina whispered. "Put your hood up and keep walking." So Julie threw her hood over her head and continued walking as if she owned the street, as if what was going down at 336 and 326 49th Street was no concern of hers. As they passed by, she could see the FBI and New York Police Department's logos splashed across the back of the men's jackets, and she was sure they could hear her heart thundering in her chest. But none of them even glanced her way. She and Petrina kept walking until they reached the end of the block, and then they turned the corner. Julie collapsed against a wall, breathing heavily. It looked as though the feds in New York's finest had teamed up to raid her business. The moment she had long dreaded had finally, irrevocably arrived. After calling Jerry and warning him off, Julie threw her cell phone away. She knew the FBI could track her by its GPS, grabbed a cab to her bank where she withdrew $10,000 in cash and bought a prepaid phone. She then hid out for a few days, meeting with her lawyer and sending her mother to collect clothing and other items, whatever was left after the raid on her Long Island home. On January 31st, 4 days after the raid, Julie walked into the 7th Precinct on the Lower East Side, her lawyer by her side, to give herself up. As she later wrote on her blog, "It was a terrible time, and it only got worse." Okay. Well, thank you for listening to that medium-sized excerpt. And now I'd love to entertain questions. Any questions that you have? Yes, Linda.
So could you be more specific when you talk about how our criminal laws prevent these women and men from taking better care of themselves?
Sure. Okay. When sex workers, in countries where sex work is illegal, clients and sex workers fear getting arrested. So they rush transactions and they don't have time to negotiate safe sex, i.e. sex with condoms. And that's shown in countries where sex work is legal, like the Netherlands, New Zealand, parts of Australia, and some other countries in Europe. They take more time and they're more likely to negotiate safe sex. So they're more likely to protect themselves from HIV. They also have better access to health care than marginalized sex workers do, particularly street walkers. So that's one reason. Okay, that's the public health argument for why we should decriminalize safe. And also, social workers could work with them, and outreach groups could hand out condoms more readily. I mean, they do that, but it's frowned upon in many places. So again, they are not given the equipment they need to practice safe sex. From a public safety perspective, because sex workers fear getting arrested if they go to the police, they are often the first ones to see if there's a violent predator on the street. So for example, with Gary Ridgway, who was that infamous serial killer in Washington State, he killed both prostitutes and non-prostitutes, he confessed to killing upwards of 49 women. He was convicted of killing several dozen. But there were street workers that knew that he was the Green River Killer, that the police were looking for this Green River Killer, okay? And they had even interviewed Gary Ridgway, but he was an upstanding family man, so they let him go. And so some sex workers did go to the police. They weren't believed. And again, they believed Gary Ridgway, and he continued killing over the sex workers. Other sex workers were afraid to go to the police, and so they didn't sound the alarm. And this has happened with other killers like Ted Bundy. There was a killer in central Massachusetts that I talk about. The Long Island killings, again, they won't come forward because they fear being arrested themselves. So it would, you know, and again, the kind of men who kill sex workers also kill other women. So if in countries where sex is legal, and particularly in New Zealand, sex workers feel very safe, and they don't experience the kind of violence that sex workers do here. Good question. Yes.
When did the term sex workers enter the
Lexicon. That's a great question. In the late 1970s, Carol Lee, who I interviewed for my book, and she's in the book, she's known as the Scarlet Harlot. That's her nom de plume. She actually coined the term because she wanted people to recognize that prostitution is work, and it should be considered work, and it's, you know, it's paid work. I mean, but it's the only form of paid work that is, you know, where there's an exchange of a service for money that's illegal. So other than homicide, actually hiring a hired gun. But that's where the term sex work comes from. Yeah. Yes?
Because you go into a lot of detail about the women and their lives, locations, what about repercussions for them, and how did you deal with that, protecting them?
Yeah, it's a good
getting
question.
them to go on the
Well,
record?
most of the women in the book I identify only by their what we call their work names. Julie Moya was a rare exception, and I kept asking her, you know, are you sure you want me to use your real name in the book? And she said, yes, I want my story told. She has an amazing story, from being, you know, put in the witness protection program, and then coming up, you know, having a new life, you know, in New York, and then getting arrested again. And she was a madame in 2 brothels, very successful brothels, for 20 years before she was arrested, and then she's, up until very recently, was also a madame at, in Midtown Manhattan as well. But most of them, I kept their real names private, and only used their work names, and we negotiated if there were certain identity things that they wanted me to say, you know, just like you would with any off-the-record source, with any anonymous source. Yes. Because, yeah, I mean, they're working, because it's stigmatized and because it's illegal, it's a dangerous trade. Yes?
Is it your impression that in places where it is legal, that there is in general a healthier attitude both towards sex and women?
I think you're right. Absolutely. It's all part of, I think that, you know, in our country we have a double standard about sex. We are afraid to talk about it openly and honestly. I was on a radio show the other day, and we were talking, they were asking me, why do men go to prostitutes? And I said that if there could be more open dialogue between, you know, couples about what each desires and their sexual desires and how to answer them, there would be a lot less need for prostitution. But there's just a lot of people that won't talk openly about sex, or you know, are afraid to entertain their partner's desires for you know, and I'm not talking about the kind of sex that is harmful and painful. That, you know, nobody should have to entertain that. But so I think that there's a lot of stigma about both sex and women. And what's interesting is that in this, the reason why, and this isn't my theory, this was first written about by Kingsley Davis, who wrote a wonderful paper called The Sociology of Prostitution in the 1920s, in which he talked about how the reason why sex work has become so vilified is because they needed to differentiate it from marriage. Marriage is this sacred institution precisely because it leads to reproduction. It's where reproduction should happen, and it leads to the next future generations. So societies and religious groups wanted to, you know, make marriage a sacred institution, but because there's no thought of reproduction where sex work is concerned, people are just having sex for pleasure, not for reproduction, they needed to vilify. So that's where you get these terms, you know, the whore, the slut, you know, and sex workers began to be vilified. And this is a century-old stigma, okay? And then it's made worse because of the sexism involved. I mean, you know, it's the sex worker who's vilified, not the man who goes to the sex worker. you know, and then this is happening even today where there's so many arrests of sex workers and very few clients are arrested. Now, I'm not in favor of arresting clients because I think that's very counterproductive and also leads to the same public health problems that we were talking about earlier. But I think a combination of sexism and this religious point of view about prostitution that has just been entrenched for centuries is why there's so much stigma around sex work. Yes, Niles.
Hard question. So I read articles all the time of young people being exploited by the fact that they run out of money and so forth, and the only way they can do this is by having sex, and then after a while they talk about drugs. Isn't that, how big a problem is that relative to the sex workers that you talk about?
Okay. Well, streetwalkers, according to one study I read, today streetwalkers are only really 2% of the population of sex workers, and many of them are drug addicted. Okay, and it is a problem, and particularly underage prostitution is a problem. And we need to focus on underage prostitution. Instead of, what happens is with law enforcement, they spend a lot of their energies entrapping adult prostitutes who are doing consensual sex. As one Las Vegas police detective said to a reporter, it's a lot more fun. You know, we have set up this suite in one of the Las Vegas casinos, and we have a great time. We have sex, and then we bust them. And I'd much rather do that. So you know, it's a lot easier, and it's more fun to go after them. But the problem is that there is a problem with teenage runaways. And often these are boys and girls that have been abused or neglected at home. Or in the case of lesbian or gay individuals, they've been pushed out of their homes and made to feel entirely unwelcome. So they've run away to larger cities and they're selling sex for survival on the streets. And you know, it is my contention that what they need are social services. We should be putting our money into social services that give them housing and support and education and counseling rather than arresting them. There are still many of these youngsters get arrested and they get re-traumatized by the criminal justice system. So I think our priorities are wrong there. I mean, and that's not to say that there are adult women that are being exploited, but it's a lot lower percentage than you hear about. And trafficking is also much more grossly inflated, and I can talk about that as well. Yes?
Individuals that you interviewed, and how did you get them to confide in you?
Well, that's a good question. I started with Jillian because she was the first person I met, and she was the first prostitute I had coffee with. And, and she, you know, and I gained her trust, and she put out my name on a listserv, a private listserv that went to a lot of other sex workers around the country, and I got calls from all over the country from sex workers who wanted to talk to me and tell me their story because they wanted, and then I went to a conference on sex work for sex workers in Las Vegas, no less. And I talked to a number there, and I was always very open about, you know, I'm writing a book, and, you know, we can decide, you know, whether you want your real name used or you don't, or how you want to be described. And many of them wanted to come forward to tell the truth about their profession. They're proud of their profession. They view it as a business, as a career. And I talk about in the book an increasing number of middle-class women who are going into sex work. And that's because there's not a lot of good paying jobs for women in our society, even college graduates. So for women who are trying to pay off student loans or even trying to make their way through school, or are single mothers trying to raise a family, they find that sex work gives them the flexibility and economic independence they need that they can't get from low-paying jobs. So that's how, yeah. Go ahead.
So you made the point before, and I think that a lot of us can agree with this, that in this country, like, there's kind of this stigma against, like, openly talking about sex. Because you made this argument that, like, sex working should be decriminalized, have you gotten a lot of backlash or, like, opposition because of this argument?
Well, occasionally I get, I've had a few radio interviews so far. I mean, the book just came out this week. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot more backlash. But you know, occasionally, you know, I have radio interviews asking me, well, what about the moralistic point of view? And the way I look at it, I don't really take a moralistic stance on it. I'm kind of talking about it from a public health and public safety aspect. But I don't see a paid transaction for an hour, or overnight. In other words, a man or a woman paying for, and there are not too many women paying, but mostly men, paying for an hour or overnight for a girlfriend experience. It's any different from what Donald Sterling, the former owner of the LA Clippers, was doing in keeping a much younger woman as his mistress and spending millions of dollars on her. I mean, to me, that's, and people that, take people out for a meal and expect sex, that's kind of an implicit bargain, right? That's an implicit exchange of sex for money. So here's people making it explicit. I'll give you sex in return for this much money, and I don't really see that there's any difference. Yes?
In places where sex work is legal now, in the event that birth control does fail and then the woman decides to keep the child, is a man liable still for like 18 years of child support?
That's a good question. Probably. If they can document that he's the father and there's DNA, then he probably is liable. But in legal countries, sex workers are very, like I said, there's very low HIV rates. Netherlands has among the lowest HIV rates in the world. It's one of the countries that has longest had both first sex work decriminalized and then legalized, okay? And that's because sex workers use condoms. In fact, in the run-up to World War I and World War II, and I talk about the history of prostitution in this country, and in the run-up to World War I and World War II, the federal government was so worried that soldiers would pick up venereal disease from prostitutes that they closed down red light districts, okay? But research shows, and there's studies that show, that the soldiers were much more likely to get venereal disease from casual pickups, and casual sex than from prostitutes, because it's their livelihood, and so they take very good care of themselves in terms of practicing safe sex, the vast majority of them. Yes?
It seems like you focus primarily on female sex workers. I wonder what your experience is with male sex workers, and could you contrast what happens with male sex workers versus female sex workers?
That's a good question. I do write about male sex workers in my book, and what's interesting is that they are much less likely to get arrested and harassed by police. Again, it's the sexist, moralistic tone that, if a woman's having sex and enjoying sex with multiple partners, she's got to be a slut and we've got to shut her down, okay? Male sex workers are very rarely arrested. A recent exception was that raid on rentboy.com. It was a website that catered to gay escorts. It was, in my opinion, a tremendous waste of taxpayer dollars, because there's no evidence that anybody was being trafficked via that website. It was a website where gay escorts could meet clients and arrange rendezvous. And yes, they were, the website was facilitating prostitution, but, they shut them down and arrested the operators, and everybody just migrated to another website. It's my argument that it's much safer to allow sex workers to advertise on these websites so that they can, first of all, it allows them to operate more independently of pimps, because they don't need pimps to get them clients. They can do it themselves, and they can handle their own screening, and it actually makes them much less reliant on pimps. And it also, again, allows them to screen clients. So, and what happens when you start closing down websites like Backpage, or Craigslist was the first one, and now Rentboy, is that the more marginalized sex workers might be forced to go to the street and to find clients. And that's a much more dangerous venue, so you don't want that. But as I said, so I did talk to, one of the most interesting male escorts I met was Legendary Dave. He was at the conference that I went to in Las Vegas, and he came into this session bare-chested, barefoot, cut off shorts. He was the most, casual guy I've ever seen. And he has a thriving escort service in Washington, D.C. He gets paid thousands of dollars for his work. He provides a service. to men who, largely aren't out of the closet yet, but have needs. Well, let me just, yes. Yes.
I have a question. In the book, do you only speak about like high-end like escorts, or because it's like 2015 and the sex work industry? Like if you look online, there's so different like.
There's many different types. No, I cover the range. I interviewed a number of domitrices, and I also talked to a lot of streetwalkers. I went to HIPS, which is an outreach program in Washington, D.C., and I met a number of minority, actually transgender sex workers, and spent some time talking with them. And one of the women I feature in my book is a transgender sex worker. Elle St. Clair, an amazing woman. So I tried to cover the whole range of, and even, one of the transgender sex workers that I spoke to, she was born a man and transitioned to becoming a transgender woman. She is at Howard University right now and paying her own way through school, and she's one of 12 children. And she said, she was so proud that she didn't have to burden her mother was a single mother, with her tuition, that she could take care of herself. And that was a real big source of pride for her. Yes?
You talk about how your stance is that it should be legalized and regulated. What are your thoughts on separating regulation of services from regulation of sexuality and regulation of bodies? Kind of like, how do you keep it so that it's not, like, while we're regulating services, we're not further stigmatizing it by regulating women's or men's bodies or regulating their sexuality?
Mm-hmm. Well, it has to be done very carefully. And the most successful approach is in New Zealand, where they basically, in 2003, got rid of all the laws against adult consensual prostitution. So in other words, child prostitution is still illegal, as it should be, and so is trafficking. Once they decriminalized those laws, then they basically regulated all venues of prostitution. So brothels, spas, massage parlors, they're regulated by the municipality in which they exist. And the municipality can decide where they want these brothels to be. Now, they're not near a playground or a school or not in a residential area. They can restrict them. They can decide they don't want any brothels in their community, right? So it depends on the community. It depends on the municipality and the county where they, to make that decision. And then they regulate the brothels, and if they'd have regular inspections, and if the brothels are found to employ like illegal immigrants, they shut them down. So it's regulated and it's taxed like any other business. But I think that's as far as it should go. I don't think that, sex workers should have to register with the state. They do in Nevada. I mean, a lot of sex workers don't think the model in Nevada is very workable, practical, and it's very patriarchal, really, because they mandate testing and they force all the women working the brothels to register as sex workers. So that, to a lot of people, that's very scary, because it exposes them as sex workers. And I think that doing that is just counterproductive because it will continue sex workers working in the illegal sector. But New Zealand doesn't require that. So individual sex workers don't have to register. But they can work together in small groups and watch each other's backs, basically. And that's a really effective model. The problem that's happening right now is with a lot of anti-trafficking laws are being misenforced, so the police arrest the sex workers and charge them with trafficking each other when it's not. They're working by choice instead of going after the real traffickers. And again, because it's easier and they're operating much more out in the open than actual traffickers do. Yes, Linda.
So is that what you meant when you said that the trafficking statistics might be misleading?
Yes. What happens is that the trafficking, they include all prostitutes. So, where they say groups like the Coalition Against Trafficking against Trafficking of Women, they say, well, there's between 100,000 and 400,000 women and children being trafficked in the United States today. That's a patently false statistic. And it was actually been debunked many, many times. It actually comes from a study where somebody looked at all the potential people at risk of going into the sex trade. And that got breathlessly re-reported in all the mainstream media, and it's patently false. Also, you have to keep in mind that anybody under the age of 18 who does sex work is automatically considered a trafficking victim, whether they consider themselves or not, but they're considered a victim because that's the age of consent. You know, I have a whole chapter where I talk about what the real statistics are behind trafficking, and the problem is nobody knows the actual, because we haven't done good studies about it. There's an FBI study that found, 2 studies actually, that found that on a yearly basis about 1,400 juveniles are arrested for commercial sex. But that's only the number that come to the attention of law enforcement. But 1,400 versus 400,000. You know, the truth is somewhere, you know, I'd say in the tens of thousands of people who are being trafficked, and that includes children, underage prostitutes as well. Yes?
Do you have any sense about how many of the women involved enjoy the sex and how many are doing it not for fun, like most of us do jobs, not for fun?
Yeah, yeah.
Pay the bill?
I get a range on that. Some sex workers consider it very empowering, and they like it. Jillian, for instance, she really enjoys it. She says that it's loosened her up and made her a better partner to her longtime boyfriend. And another woman said the same thing, that it's made her a better listener to her husband, because sex workers have to be really good listeners. Because the men going to sex workers are not really there, I mean, they are there for the sex, but they're also there for the intimacy, for someone who will listen to them in a non-judgmental way, and to act out their fantasies. So what was the original question? I got off point.
Just with the sense that you had, you know, how many of the women are enjoying it? And
Oh yeah, I mean, I think a lot of them view it as a business, as a job. If they didn't like it, most of them wouldn't be in it. Yes, but you know, there are women who are being forced to go into it. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, it does. But it's a lot smaller number than we think.
no, I even met women not forced.
But
it's
yeah,
just
but
that not-
I think you know, the women I talked to, the escorts I talked to enjoyed it. And the male sex, the satisfaction among male sex workers and transgender sex work is even higher, much higher than for female sex workers.
But isn't it also an economic thing? I mean, the high-end escorts who are spending going to fine dinners and taking taxi cabs home versus schlepping through
Right,
rainfall on the street.
And that's right. And also there was an interesting study done by a Dutch researcher who found that there's, you know, about a quarter of sex workers, mostly street walkers, and these are people with a history of child abuse, okay? And they are fairly miserable and depressed and don't want to be doing what they do, okay? And then there's another quarter who are pretty analogous with other women on the continuum of their satisfaction about their lives. And then there is a quarter that's actually got better well-being than your normal average woman. So, you know, and those are the high-end escorts you're talking about, because they can choose who their clients are, and a lot of the escorts I talk to are very picky about what they'll do and what they want to and what clients they'll go with, and they get paid a lot more, and so they have more flexibility in refusing clients they're not interested in, and yeah, so it's all over the map. Yeah.
Curious if you knew, you know, ballpark what percentage of sex workers are in long-term relationships, and if you're able to get any sort of sense on, from your discussions with them, what their partners thought about them being sex workers.
Well, I couldn't give you statistical stuff. A lot of the women that I interviewed are in, they're either married or in long-term relationships, and then, you know, some aren't. You know, they kind of reflect the general population in that regard. I don't think, you know, they necessarily have more of a problem with intimacy or commitment, although some might, okay? Particularly those, and again, among the streetwalkers, there's a higher percentage of those who've been abused as children. And, but among the indoor sex workers, the escorts, there isn't a higher percentage. They're very much like you and me, okay? But they're doing it largely, as you say, for economic reasons and for the flexibility it gives them, and some of them because they really enjoy what they do and they see it as a service. that they're helping men who might not otherwise get laid, or men who have psychological issues and who can't commit themselves to relationships. So a lot of them see themselves as health therapists. Ironically, yeah.
Just going off that a little bit, have you been able to get a sense, I know you haven't talked to probably the boyfriends or the husbands of these individuals, but what, do you think there's any...
Oh yeah, that was one of the things.
Just how,
Well,
how
actually,
they view that
yeah,
situation.
I mean, obviously, it depends. There, you know, which one? The husband of Anna, who works in a legal brothel, supported her and thought it actually turned him on that what she was doing. Okay, there are others who are very supportive of their partners doing it. Now, obviously, if you're in a married relationship, you're probably not doing sex work if your, spouse disapproves of it, because they're going to find out, and then you're going to be in trouble. So, because it's a lot of stigma, and I'm sure there are many men that can't tolerate that. Absolutely. Yes, David.
You mentioned that it seems that law enforcement focuses its energies and resources on the lower end sex workers. Is that just because they are more visible, or is it analogous to the crack cocaine versus powder cocaine sentencing system that was in place, where it's the same conduct, but it's even more immoral if the lower
Right.
part of it?
Well, part of it is that it's more visible. Part of it is simple racism. That it's more like, if they see a well-dressed black woman crossing the street in Las Vegas, they're much more likely to arrest her. And in fact, that happened than they would a white woman. At the Desiree Alliance, this conference I went to in Las Vegas, there were two women coming back late at night, and they might have been a little tipsy. They were coming back to the hotel, and one of them was black and one of them was white, and the black woman was arrested and spent the night in jail. She wasn't a sex worker, as it turned out, but she refused. The police said, "Oh, well, you're jaywalking. You have to pay a $200 fine because you're jaywalking," and she refused to pay it. And so she ended up in jail overnight. Another incident, when I was out there, I had dinner at this Bavarian restaurant that we went to later with our kids. And I was sitting at the same table. You sit at these big tables with the beer and the wine and everything. And there were two African-American women sitting next to me. So we got into a conversation. I told them what I was there for. And they told me that they were stopped when coming out of a nightclub late at night, and because the police thought they were prostitutes. Now, that would not happen to a white woman of the same age coming out of a nightclub. So there's both of those things going on. Part of it is also the visibility, and also in neighborhoods, people don't want streetwalkers loitering at their neighborhood. So the visibility has a lot to do with it as well. Okay, well, I'll entertain one more question, and then we got to get some food, and I'm happy to sign some books. Yes.
If prostitution was legal and regulated, and in the event that a sexual assault occurred, because the process, I guess, is a transaction and the consent is almost implied, would it complicate the proceedings at all? Because I guess
Well, are you saying, a rape is a rape? Is that what you're saying? If there's an assault?
I'm saying, would it complicate the proceedings of the court, I guess, if the woman was a sex worker and they meet up and they...
and there's an assault.
And they agree on the sex, I guess, but...
Well, because of the social stigma.
I'm saying, would it complicate it?
It would complicate it, yes, because they would be considered less credible in a court of law, a sex worker who said she was assaulted or raped or robbed. And it happens all the time to sex workers. They get robbed or assaulted, and the police pay them, first of all, the prosecutors aren't interested in bringing a case because they don't think it will hold up. So yes, it definitely does complicate it. And I think even, I think it would be better if it were legalized, definitely, because police would be working with, and they would more closely with the sex work community, and they would take them more seriously and respect their rights more. But when you start from an illegal basis, and they're not supposed to be doing this anyway, and they're sluts, they're whores, then we don't have to pay any attention if they got assaulted or raped. And that happens a lot. But good question. All right, well, thank you very much for your patience.